Hi, good afternoon. Oh, I need
Right.
to actually, sorry. I started saying hello and then I realized that no one can see us, but now they can see us. It was just me talking to a black screen. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Digital Hammurabi. It is lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a lovely guest who is going to talk to us about Ishtar and power. And if that doesn't fascinate you, with just those two words, then I have nothing else to say to you. I'm looking forward to this. I know we have a couple of people in the chat who are very excited. So Dr. Monica Palmero Fernandez, thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you.
So as always, we're going to start by asking Dr. Palmero Fernandez to just give a bit of background information about herself, how she got to be in Assyriology and archaeology, and then we can get going with the information.
Right. Thank you, Ringa, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you and to all your listeners. I'm very, very happy to be here. So, I think going back in time to when I first got passionate about archaeology, I'm actually from Spain, and I decided to move to the UK to study at university. Back in 2004. And that was because at the time there wasn't a degree in archaeology in Spain. And I wanted to kind of see what else was out there. And I was interested a bit in Egypt and a little bit on that side of things. So I decided to come over to the UK and study at UCL. And while I was doing my undergraduate, I accidentally sat in some of the Mesopotamian lectures. And, that's how it all starts.
Yeah.
So I ended up becoming really interested. So I kind of switched completely to that. I did my undergraduate dissertation with Roger Matthews on the archaeology of, the archaeology of texts, which is how I also got kind of interested in the relationship between archaeology and Assyriology.
That's fascinating.
How we connect the two. And so I looked at the context of texts in archaeology. And then I went to Cambridge to do a master's in Assyriology. So that's how I kind of expanded a little bit my knowledge into the textual material from the region. And that was, that's how I got a bit of both in a way. Although I wouldn't consider myself an expert in Assyriology by any means. I am an archaeologist. I work with textual sources, in transliteration, in translation as well, and obviously rely on my expert colleagues to help me out as well with that. And then I finally did my PhD at Reading University and a little bit in Oxford. So I was going to Oxford to learn Sumerian. So that's how I continued my training a bit in the textual sources. And I was working for my PhD I wanted to work on goddesses, and I wanted to work on trying to understand a bit these, how goddesses are, in a way, how we have studied them, and the bias that exists in favor of textual analysis, whereby the archaeology sort of takes a secondary position to kind of support the ideas and the hypotheses that are formulated from the textual sources. And obviously that is a gigantic topic. So I ended up having to really narrow that down. And that's how I ended up focusing on Inanna and on 3 case studies that I looked at in my thesis, which were temples from the 3rd millennium BC in the sites of Ashur, which of course we know later on becomes the capital of the Assyrian Empire. But at the time it was a much smaller site. From Ashur, from Mari, also an important capital, and from Hafage, which is located in the Diyala region. And so I kind of focused on those 3 sites for my thesis. And I mean, I still have a lot of questions about it, but I basically looked a bit at the different sources of material that we have. So the archaeology, the images or visual sources, and the texts, and trying to kind of contextualize all of them and try to understand how they interact with each other, and how that interrelation brings about the sort of religious ideas and behavior that we see reflected in the archaeological record and in the text that we find.
That sounds
so that's a bit how I was approaching it.
Yeah, no, I love it. And it's interesting, that dichotomy you spoke of between the archaeology being used by Assyriologists mainly to kind of as a secondary layer of research to support things they found in the text is...
I think it goes both ways. I think archaeologists themselves sometimes rely, on the text to kind of inform some of the interpretations as well. So I don't think it's necessarily just the Assyriologists who are doing this in a way. I think it's obviously easier to rely on texts when they are available. If we go back before we have texts, all we have is archaeology, and we really need to use the archaeological records and inform that, supplement that with specific theoretical framework to try and understand and interpret what we see. So in a way, with text, it becomes easier because, we have, there's people kind of talking through those texts, and we tend to use them to kind of understand what's going on in the archaeology. But I think that sometimes there can be an over-reliance that can sort of influence, not necessarily in a positive way, how we understand what's going on.
Yeah. No, I agree. And something that I like what you were saying about using the visual representations and the archaeology and the text and kind of combining them, instead of treating them as 3 distinct units of research. Something that I enjoyed looking at was when I was doing my dissertation was the inscriptions as archaeological artifacts, and like remembering that actually they have context, they have find spots, and I think all too often that's kind of not, I think, deliberately ignored, but seen as unimportant, or not really recorded anywhere. Anyway, that was a fantastic introduction. Thank you. Everybody listening, if you have questions for Monica, please do put them in the side chat. Make sure you tag me, because if you don't tag me, I won't see them. So then your questions won't get asked. We will get to those at the end. Monica, where would you like to start?
Well, I don't know really. I mean, it's up to you as well what you would like to look at, but perhaps we can begin sort of thinking about the context of what I'm going to be talking about. So I think there is a map somewhere.
There is a map
that we can share, and we can kind of use that to also remind myself of what I want to say.
Definitely. No, that everyone can see that now. That is up. It's the Inanna Ishtar in the early dynastic period.
Yes, perfect. Right. So for my PhD, I focus on the early dynastic period, which covers most of the 3rd millennium BC in the region of Mesopotamia, from about 2900 to 2330 BC with the Akkadian conquest. And this is a time that, if you know a little bit about the region, it's a time when we have the so-called city-states. So we have a lot of different sites and settlements that seem to be kind of collaborating with each other, but also competing with each other for control of the agricultural land and the resources that were available, and the trading networks that expanded beyond the region to incorporate very important materials for Mesopotamia, such as precious stones, so carnelian, lapis lazuli, and so on. Metals like gold and silver and other metals. What else? Wood would also be something that would have been traded. So these are all important relationships that were going on between these sites. What I was trying to understand in my thesis was, okay, so I started thinking, okay, so where do we have temples dedicated to the goddess Inanna during this period? And trying to see why the phenomenon of temples dedicated to Inanna seems to appear and kind of, exponentially grow a little, if we want to put it this way, during this period. So in the map, I have highlighted the sites that appear either in the archaeological record or in texts that seem to have temples dedicated to Inanna. And so there I have Uruk, which is in the south, and that's sort of, for a lot of people, is the city of the goddess Inanna, all the way from the prehistoric period to the 1st millennium BC. And we'll get back to that, because Uruk is a really interesting site, and it's actually quite interesting for this project. And sort of shows a little bit that bias that comes into play when looking at the archaeology and the text and the visual sources. So we'll talk about that a bit. And we have other sites like Lagash, where a temple was excavated, and we have texts that confirm that. We have in 🀭 there could be one. There are some texts that seem to suggest, but no temple has been excavated. We have Bad Tibera, which is another site where we have textual evidence, but not archaeological evidence. Sabalam, which is also one of the main seats of Inanna, and we have textual sources and possibly archaeological sources, but the site was very heavily damaged and looted in recent times during the various wars going on in Iraq. So there's unfortunately, and there is a lot of work there that needs to happen. But we know it's pretty clear there is a big temple there. And we have the site of Nippur, which of course is a very important religious site in Mesopotamia. And there was a temple that was excavated there, very important temple to Inanna. We have the site of Adab, which we do have some textual sources. There is some archaeological evidence, but they're not necessarily connected. It's not clear whether the archaeological remains are of the temple of the goddess or of a different deity. Is not clear. We have the site of Kish, another very important site of power in the 3rd millennium BC especially. And we have texts that suggest there is a temple to Inanna. We have archaeological remains of a later temple. We don't have the archaeological remains for the temple from this period, but the idea is that there would have been one there. Then we have 𝀭, which is another site that I was looking at in my PhD. We don't have a temple identified with the goddess specifically. There are some hints. It's an oval temple, which sometimes has been associated with Inanna, because the temple in Lagash is an oval temple. And the temple in Nippur seems to have an oval enclosure during the later phase of the period. So there is some connection there between oval structures and the goddess. So it could be. And then moving into the north, we have the site of Mari, which I also looked at in my thesis. And we have some, when we're moving to the north, we start to see actually the sort of Akkadian realm. So we start to see what is Ishtar, which in the 3rd millennium BC would be sort of the Akkadian equivalent. And it's not clear whether this is the same goddess or two goddesses or what's going on. And this is something that I was looking at in my thesis as well. You know, what's going on in the north? Is this the same deity? Do we have two different deities that are the same kind of deity? And what's going on there? So we have Mari. We have another temple in Ashur, which was also identified with the goddess on the basis of later structures that were identified as temples of Ishtar, so the later period. We know that there was one in Nineveh from later periods. It's unclear whether there is one in the 3rd millennium, but there's a possibility. We have textual sources from Mari that refer to a temple in a site called Sarbat. This is not actually identified geographically, but from the textual sources, it seems to be a site of worship. And finally, we have Ebla, where we do have a temple from the 2nd millennium BC with remains in the 3rd millennium BC. Again, the connection between the archaeological evidence and the text is unclear for this period, but we do have something there. So that was just a quick recap of the different sort of evidence that we have. And as I said, I focused on 3 sites, which are mainly in the northern area, so Mari, Ashur, and 𝀭. This is purely out of what I could do for my PhD, not what I kind of wanted to do. I actually wanted to look at Nippur, but unfortunately I couldn't get access to the material. So, which, you know, is always one of the things that ends up creating obstacles in your own research, where, you know, you're trying to get information and if you don't get the access or the material is not there, for example, it's a Balam, so the material is not there, so I can't do anything with that. Uruk is, we don't really have that much evidence for the early dynastic. A lot of the evidence is from the previous period, and it's very complex and it requires an entire dissertation on its own. So, you know, you have to kind of balance what you can do as well. And for those of you out there who are sort of working or studying or, you know, looking at this material, that's also an important thing to consider, you know, what you can achieve, how you're going to do it, and what is feasible, and be honest about that as well. Like, you know, it's what I could do for my PhD. Of course, I would have loved to look at all of these sites and research them, and maybe I will in the future. But for
the single project, that was
exactly. So I had to limit myself a little bit, because which
no one enjoys doing.
No, not at all. So there's quite a lot going on here. You know, you know, when you read about religion, Sumerian religion, a lot of it is about how there is one deity for one site. So, you know, in this case, Inanna is thought of being the patron deity of Uruk. There's Enlil would be the patron deity of Nippur, and Ningirsu would be the patron deity of Girsu, and so on, right? But there seems to be quite a lot of temples dedicated to Inanna out there. Inanna, Ishtar, depending on whether you're looking at it Sumerian or Akkadian. And so I was intrigued by this. Why are these temples appearing, and what is, if anything, the connection here, right? So that's a bit what I was trying to look at. And so what I found, actually, to kind of give away a little bit of a spoiler of all of this, what I discovered, though, that the common thread that emerged from my research was that there's a sort of connection to genealogy, and trying to, in a context in which we have these city-states with rulers that are coming into power and sort of creating both collaboration and conflict between each other, that they sort of need to establish their own genealogies to establish their own power and control over the territory. And what I'm sort of starting to see is that a lot of it has to do with this genealogy, and for some reason that I don't really quite understand yet, this idea of Inanna or Ishtar seems to play an important role in creating these structures and connecting these to the power structures that emerged during this period.
When you say genealogy, are you talking about the kind of like the establishment of dynastic rule, and when a king dies, his heir take? I see.
That's a really good question, and I want to really qualify that, because in Mesopotamia, and especially during this period, we don't see very much of dynastic rule, like in the sense of fathers to sons to their sons and so on. So we actually is quite dynamic. We always have kings that become kings, but who were, the cupbearer or a previous king, or so they were part of the royal court, but not necessarily the direct descendant of a previous king. There seems to be a lot of dynamics. It's a very dynamic environment in which, yes, you might have one son here and there, but not that much. It's not that common if you actually look at the evidence. Again, we don't have a lot of evidence. This is when we begin to have more text. But a lot of them are royal inscriptions, and a lot of them establish themselves in relation to the gods. And of course, Enlil seems to gain a lot of relevance in these, and ends up becoming the deity that legitimizes or gives power to the kings. And there's a very interesting theory that was developed by what is his? I think his surname is Wang. I don't know. And the book is called The Metamorphosis of Enlil. And he was basically looking. So whereas I'm looking at Inanna, he was looking at Enlil, and he was looking at. And the reason why the book is called The Metamorphosis of Enlil is because he was tracing these transformation into the supreme god of Sumer. And he suggests that these actually happened during this period. It was not earlier, that he appears to kind of gain that position towards the end of the early dynastic period, not earlier. So I think a lot of this is going on. A lot of this is a very, dynamic period in which a lot of these traditions are being created and molded, and we have we have Enlil on one end, and I think that what's happening with Inanna, Ishtar is sort of part of that as well, and she's sort of, and I say she, but they're deities, and I think they're also formulating that relationship through ritual action in creating these, in sort of legitimizing themselves in power. And when I say legitimizing, legitimizing power, I mean, it sounds as if they're doing these actively, as if they've decided that they're going to do this, which is always very tricky. I don't think this is something that they're doing
it wasn't a conscious choice
in a way, right? So they're using metaphors, they're using what is available to them to create social ties, to kind of mold the way the network of social interactions work. And I'm still working on this. Even though I finished my PhD, it still is difficult to articulate, actually. So I don't have all the details worked out, but this is what I begin to see, that there's something connected to these creation of the elites that are emerging during this period. So that's a bit the gist of what I was doing. Yes. And now we can go into a bit more detail if you want. Definitely. or if there are any questions, or should we wait until the end? I don't know.
There are no questions yet, but there will be, I'm sure.
Okay.
So
all right.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I guess that, when the main the main obstacle that I faced in all of these was, okay, so what about Uruk? What's happening? Uruk is the city of the goddess, from prehistoric times. And this is something, even though I didn't include Uruk as one of my case studies, but I actually included Uruk a lot in my literature review and the sort of the preliminary work that goes into it, and trying to understand again and articulate a lot of the biases that exist around our understanding of the goddess. So we can look a bit at Uruk, and there is, let me check, and I can tell you. So Uruk is, so if we go to the next image, perhaps, we can sort of begin to talk a little bit about Uruk and what's going on there. And I'm sure that some of the people who are listening will kind of know a little bit about this, or maybe this would be an interesting introduction to the site as well. So this is a very stylized plan of the central area of the site of Uruk in the 4th millennium BC. And to give you an idea, so Uruk is a very large site. It grew up to 250 hectares. And it was excavated for a very long time by a German team, basically throughout the 20th century, pretty much. So there's a lot of work done here. Unfortunately, a lot of it was focused on the central area of the site, which is here represented in the bottom right-hand corner. So it has a bit the outline of the site, and the red square in the center, that's what is represented here in the plan. So that's the the central area, which is already quite big.
Yes.
Because and so a lot of buildings were excavated in the central area. They're all monumental buildings, large buildings that were sort of built over a long period of time. The stratigraphy, so when I say stratigraphy, for all of those non-archaeologists, that means basically the layering of buildings on top of one another. Okay, so when we excavate into the ground, we kind of follow the outline of the buildings, and we can see that they are superimposed one on top of the other, and that sort of gives us a sense of the chronology of the site. So which building was built first and which one was built later. So this is a bit of a palimpsest here. You can see that there's some on top of one another. I think the darker color is the older buildings, and the lighter color is the earlier, is the later buildings. So those would be, the later buildings would be towards the end of the 4th millennium BC, during a period that is called the late Uruk period. And so these monumental buildings, it's unclear what their function is. And they seem to be public. They're not houses. There wasn't a wall separating them from the rest of the settlement, so it seems to be quite an open space. The buildings themselves seem to have a lot of openings to go into them, which suggests that the people were not necessarily restricted going into them, or they could have held celebrations around them and so on. So they could be areas to celebrate festivals or different kinds of activities that we're not entirely sure. And so this is the area that later holds the temple of Inanna in a later period. And so we have here at the top, it says the future Ur-Nammu ziggurat. So that's a late 3rd millennium ziggurat from the Uruk III period that was built. So it's not yet here, but of course a ziggurat is a very clearly religious temple, and this would have been the temple of Inanna. But we don't know what was underneath that structure in this period. So this is where the case of text versus archaeology comes into play. So was there a temple underneath the ziggurat or not? And this is what we don't really know, at least for this period. And this is where the textual and the visual evidence comes into play, because then, so if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of the artifacts that are used to kind of formulate the hypothesis that this area and these monumental buildings were the sacred area of Inanna, even in a period where we don't have textual sources to confirm it, and we don't have a temple because it hasn't been excavated. Right? And some of these objects have been interpreted to be either the face of the goddess, such as the Lady of Warka, which is again unclear, and it's even unclear if this is male or female necessarily. There are arguments for and against, and we can go in circles all day. But let's just think outside the box a little bit. It looks like a woman, perhaps because the name already says Lady of Warka, so we kind of see it in a way, right? The Warka vase, which is also a very important object, and I don't know if this is the the best view. But at the top, there's an image of a figure that is usually interpreted to be either the goddess or the priestess of the goddess, receiving a priest king or a king or somebody, a male figure. And it's even unclear whether this figure is male or female. So a lot of the interpretation rests on understanding these images as female and connecting them with the goddess or with the cult of the goddess, which appears to be also female for some reason. So, we have to think about, are those interpretations based on the actual evidence, or are they based on our understanding of the goddess as the goddess of love or the goddess of sex, and so that those connections that we have already made in our minds based on the literature from the old Babylonian period, so the descent of Inanna to the netherworld, and the hymns to Inanna, and the hymns between Inanna and Dumuzi, and so on. So are we formulating our understanding based on material that was produced over 1,000 years later?
Yeah.
So you have to think, it's 1,000 years later. It's not just a couple hundred.
There's a substantial difference.
Yes. So just, I might be wrong, but at least I think we need to try to think about it.
It's something to be aware of, at least.
Yeah. And, one of the symbols that becomes very much connected to the goddess is at the bottom we have the Uruk trowel, and we have this ring post with a streamer, which is sort of coming out of the reed house in the center. So we have these kind of poles coming out of it with a ring at the top, and it's got like a little thing hanging from it from the back. So that's what is called the ring post with streamer. And this symbol has been connected to Inanna because the sign to write the name of the deity is thought to has been connected with this symbol, and we can look at that in a minute. So if we go to the next slide, here we have the only bit of writing that we might actually discuss a little bit. But so on the left, basically, I created this table to kind of show the interpretation that goes into connecting these, right? So we have the ring post with streamer, which appears in visual representations, some of which were found in the Uruk, in the levels associated with these monumental buildings that we were discussing earlier. And this has been connected with a sign, which is called 🀭, which is thought to be the precursor of the writing of the name of the deity. So at the other end, we have how from the early dynastic 3a, from the first god list in Mesopotamia, we have the writing of the deity, and that cuneiform sign is supposed to it is a evolution of the earlier sign from proto-cuneiform. So from the texts that were found in Uruk around the same level as the monumental buildings that we were discussing. And there is a lot of uncertainty around the archaeological context of many of these texts. And this is where it becomes problematic, because a lot of these texts were actually, so they were discarded at some point. thrown out on the side of somewhere outside the site. And then at a later point in time, they were sort of kind of brought back in, so dug up to fill the foundations of a later structure. Mm-hmm. So in archaeology, that's what we call a redeposition. So, a primary context would be a text that is found in the place where it is used. So, for example, the library of Ashurbanipal was mm-hmm. found in a primary context because it was found inside the palace, where it would have been stored in life. A secondary context would be when a text is not used anymore and it is chucked into a rubbish deposit. And then archaeologists go in and they find it in the rubbish deposit. And so that's it's found not in the context in which it was used, but in a context in which it was discarded, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a tertiary context. So it's after it's been discarded, somehow it ends up being somewhere, it's moved somewhere else. And now we don't know what the original context in which it was used was. Mm-hmm. And this is the main problem, is that a lot of the times we associate these texts with the archaeology without thinking that actually these texts are out of context. And that doesn't mean that they were not connected to what was going on in this area. It just means that we need to be a bit more careful about how we connect them. Mm-hmm. Right. So in a way, that's a bit what's going on. So the idea here is that so this ring post with streamer is a symbol of the goddess that ends up being the name of the goddess, and so that sort of ends up connecting the dots, and so people are like, okay, so we're in business. Mm-hmm. Inanna is here, and this is the city of Inanna, and so on and so forth. But there is also a different interpretation. So these symbols are found, as we saw before, sticking out of these reed buildings. And if we look at the table on the left, there is one column that says temple household, right? Yes. So this is a similar, a similar sign or the symbol. And it is on a sort of semicircular bit at the bottom. And this is understood to signify this sort of either a turtle back settlement or one of these reed buildings with the symbol sticking out. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that these symbols are connected somehow with the idea of a household, right? So we are in Uruk. It's a massive site. We have all these monumental buildings that we're a bit unsure what's happening. Mm-hmm. We have some texts that are found kind of unconnected to the structures. And they seem to talk about different households. And these households later on seem to be somehow connected to what we end up knowing as deities. But jumping from that to saying that Uruk is the city of Inanna, there's still a little bit of a gap there that has not been filled. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that these households appear in the text, but the one that is connected to Inanna is not necessarily the only one. So how are they interacting between each other? Mm-hmm. And what is the connection to Uruk? So if the household of Inanna is the only one, how is that connected with the other ones? Mm-hmm. And I don't have the answer to that because there's more work that needs to be done in that sense. But the evidence that we have is very limited, and so I think and it's limited to Uruk as well. So what is going on in other sites? We still don't know so much. So I think that we just need to wait a little bit to kind of make those arguments there.
Yeah.
No question, Uruk was a very important place. That's for sure. My feeling, and this is more, it's just based more on my kind of feeling out of the material, rather than, I could not say for sure. But I think that Uruk is a place where a lot of these households are coming together. So I don't think it's one household alone. I think there's this more going on. So
like a communal area, maybe.
Not a commune. I don't really know. There's so much more that we need to find out. But it certainly grows to the extension and the size that it grows, because obviously it's bringing something together.
Yeah.
And I don't think it has anything to do with Inanna at this point, or not just Inanna anyway. And this is a bit the bit that I'm trying to kind of highlight here, is that there's of course it's an important site, of course, but Uruk is the city. It's the site. I think it goes beyond just Inanna. I think there's a different
something
level
more complex than that.
We have these seals, which are on the right, that they're called the Gendet Nasser city seal, and then which is from that period, from sort of the end of the 4th millennium, beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, and then a later version from the earlier part of the early dynastic, from Ur, that seem to represent cities. And that's the interpretation that Roger Matthews, who studied these seals, gave, is that they are representing names of cities, and there seems to be some interaction between them. And what I want to kind of point out here is, so the site of Uruk, or Unuk, which is spelled here, so it has this sort of incremental, so this shape, but there's no ring post there. There's no symbol of Inanna, for example. Whereas the name of Sabalam, right, it has that symbol, whatever that is. I mean, I think I would leave it as household. I don't know if it's connected to a deity yet. I don't know that, but it is a household, some sort of kinship or relationship or something. So it's definitely there with Sabala, but it's not with Uruk or Unuk. And all the other ones seem to have some of these poles. So Uri, which is the city of Ur, has this pole attached. Nibru, which is Nippur, has this Lord sign, which seems to be connected with Enlil somehow. It's not clear, and so on. So they seem to have some symbols attached to them, but Uruk doesn't, and I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting that this is sort of the city, it's their site, but it doesn't seem to have anything in that sense. So that's what I was sort of, I don't have the answers. I just think that it's interesting to see what the evidence is and how it stacks up against the rest of the evidence, and what we don't know yet. Yeah. What we need to kind of find out a bit more.
No, it's definitely interesting.
Yeah. So for me, Uruk is a very important site, but it's not necessarily the city of Inanna at this point. So before the early dynastic here. before the early dynastic, I don't see that connection yet. I see a lot of things going on, mm-hmm. But not necessarily the city of Inanna. Mm-hmm. So that kind of, for me, deconstructs the narrative about the goddess. So whereas before we were formulating who Inanna was based on the literary texts from a later period on the one hand, so we had the descent of Inanna and the hymns and the Dumuzi and Inanna series and so on, which we know from the second millennium, mm-hmm. or at least sort of the late third millennium anyway. And then on the other hand, what happened is that we transposed a bit all of that onto the evidence from the late fourth millennium. Mm-hmm. In a way, we were used, those notions were used to kind of flip that back into the prehistoric period, mm-hmm. and suggest that Inanna has existed since prehistory, and she's always been in Uruk, and so on and so forth. And I'm trying to see, okay, so that doesn't seem so clear what's going on in the late fourth millennium. Yeah. So what's going on in the middle, in the third millennium BC? Mm-hmm. What's happening there? And that's a bit where it kind of started, when I started to look into it. Mm-hmm. So for me, the early dynastic, so the part of most of the third millennium BC, is a period in which a lot of these identities and the identity and the image of the deities is being formulated, and Inanna is one of those. Right. So that's what I was sort of working on. Mm-hmm. So that's Uruk, which is one side. And what happens is, the interesting bit is that when we move into the early dynastic, right? So we begin to see,
the next one.
Let's look at, not the next one. Let's look at the slide that says Uruk Eanna early dynastic. So I think that will be better.
Reconstruction.
Yeah. So the plan, right?
Yeah.
So when we move on to the early dynastic, so you can see the shade of the earlier monumental buildings and so on. And now we begin to see that on top of these earlier structures, a much larger building was constructed. We don't know so much about it because a lot of re-excavation and reconstruction happened at the time, and it's unclear. Mm-hmm. But this is sort of early dynastic period, actually the late early dynastic period. A much bigger building which appears to look more like a palace, mm-hmm. Was built. And we begin to have some evidence for what's going on under the ziggurat. And what was found was a platform that seems to, it begins to look more like a temple, and what a temple looks like in later periods, mm-hmm. Or a ziggurat, and it's got a platform, it's got a wall around the platform. We don't know that much. At the time, they were tunneling through to excavate these, so it's not too clear.
Yeah,
but it certainly looks more like it. And so even though the evidence that we have is limited, I think that what we are beginning to see here is really the remains of more of what a temple and an associated structure like a palace in the later towards the end of the early dynastic, mm-hmm. Appears to be. And this is, this connection between this platform and this building that sort of looks like a large administrative or palace compound begins to connect the relationship between power and and religion in that case on the temple. So I think this transition is an important one. And this is where I think we begin to see what's going on here. But we just don't have evidence for this period. From Uruk or the early dynastic, we have very little. So we need to look elsewhere.
Do you see the same connection, archaeologically speaking, between the palaces and the temples in the other sites that you were looking at in your thesis?
Definitely, we do to some extent, and in other sites as well. So, I mean, the relationship between palaces and temples is a strange one, and Elizabeth Stone has written quite a bit about that, and you know, she looks at when palaces actually appear and where they are located in the settlements. You know, how do you bring into an existing urban fabric such a monumental structure? You know, and she was looking at how they are built, you know, on the edges of the sites, or you know, whereas a temple is on one end and the palace is on the other, and what's going on, or whether they are sort of incorporated into the temples. There's more work to do there as well. We know that the kings and the royal families end up becoming very much associated with the temple. So from the text that we have from 𒀭Su, for example, so the temple of the goddess 𒀭, so was basically that household was run by the queen. And is very much associated with her in that sense. So there is definitely that relationship being created. And I mean, we have this whole theory about temple states and whether the sites, the city states were run by the temples or not, and so on. And again, that's a question that continues to be contested. Temples from when we have the evidence, which is the later part of the early dynastic, have they're large households, and they have large estates that they manage for agriculture. But palaces also seem to have large estates. So there seems to be, you know, the sort of temple households and the secular households of the palaces as well. And there's still more evidence to come on that from the Assyriologists that I won't sort of go too much into detail, because I have more limited knowledge of that. But there seems to be both estates associated with temples, which are very large, but also estates that could be associated with the palaces as well. And the relationship between the two, I think it varies. I don't think it's the same everywhere. I think it varies depending on the site as well.
I think given I'm just going to switch back to the large map you provided. I think given the massive geographical area we're talking about, expecting them to be the same relationship would be a little hopeful. And maybe a bit naive.
Yes. But, you know, it's at this time when they're developing, you know, their ways of managing this land and managing their relationship with their neighbors and with the, as I mentioned at the beginning, the sort of the trading networks that are being constructed and solidified at this time. So I think that there's room for, when we try to find something that works for everything, I think we lose a little bit the picture, the variability and the flexibility in a lot of these systems, especially at a time, at a formative period when I think a lot of these ideas are being, and these structures and the behavior that comes associated with them is being, molded in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that, you have the Akkadian conquest that somehow kind of brings all of these together, mm-hmm. and makes it, allows for such a large structure to contain all of these regional identities, mm-hmm. under one structure of power.
Yeah.
And you need to kind of create something that works for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And they were surprisingly successful.
For a while, yeah.
Yeah.
For a while. Yeah. There's the jury's still out on what happens. Some people talk about environmental stress, and there's a lot of different factors that can affect the success or the demise, mm-hmm. of such a large social and political organization. Mm-hmm. I think it's a pretty unstable thing in general. Mm-hmm. It needs a lot of work and effort to maintain such a large structure. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but that's moving ahead to the Akkadian period. It's a bit too far ahead.
Too late.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
But anyway, I mean, if you want, we can look a little bit at what I found from these other sites, for the early dynastic. And I'm very aware of the time. I don't know how long you want to keep going.
But honestly, it's as long as you are happy to talk for.
Well, I don't want to bore people to death.
Most people are still here and still engaged, so I think we're good to keep going.
Okay, so let's see what else is going on outside of Uruk. So the next slide, which is of the site of Mari. So we saw on the map as well that Mari is a bit further north from sort of the core of Sumer, as we tend to call it. Mari is a very interesting site. It's kind of at the crossroads a little bit. For some time, it was thought that it was like a southern colony or outpost or something. There's a lot of different things going on. The architecture is very different. The temples are very different, but it still has the palace that is kind of similar, and it's a bit of a mix. And so what I looked at actually is there are some sites which I sort of highlighted in red, and in red are 3 areas of what we know what has been excavated. 3 areas where we find Ishtar. And now I'm saying Ishtar because we are in an Akkadian area. So even though the name of the deity was spelled using the Sumerian logogram, it is now read as in Akkadian, because that they were actually speaking Akkadian and using some of the logograms to represent ideas and concepts. And as I said, it's not clear whether this is the same deity. I don't think it's the same deity. And what's interesting, what's happening is that on the left, so we have a temple located on the edge of the site. By the way, I haven't actually explained this. So the image on the left is the site during the period that is called City 2, which is associated with the late early dynastic. And the plan on the right is associated with the City 3 period, which is in the early 2nd millennium BC, so old Babylonian period. And I'll explain why this is important. So on the left plan, on the left, we have a temple that was excavated where they found some statues, one of a king of Mari called Yiski Mari, containing inscriptions, dedications, or commemorative inscriptions to a deity that is called Inanna or Ishtar, and then Nita, which is a Sumerian logogram that means male. So a lot of people were like, well, this is a male Inanna for some reason. Some people started to see more into it and started to talk about Venus and the morning and the evening star, and whether one is female and one is male. All I would say is that all the evidence for that comes from much later periods. It is, for this period, there is no evidence for that dichotomy in terms of gender. It is unclear why this particular deity has this male name to it, but I don't think it has anything to do with the morning or the evening star necessarily. Anyway, so then we have the corner, one of the corners of the palace, which is the big building in green. So inside the green circle, there's a little red circle. And so that's the area that was the sacred quarter of the palace, which contained what appeared to be a shrine or a small temple in there. And it could be associated with another kind of Inanna deity or Dumutsi, Ama Oshunga, which is the earlier name for Dumutsi or whatever. That's a bit unclear, but let's leave it there. And then we have a third red circle where we had another temple that was excavated. Well, actually two temples that were excavated there. One of which was contained statues with inscriptions dedicated to a deity named Ishtar Sarbat. And I don't know, at the beginning I mentioned a site of Sarbat that we have not located geographically, but that appears in texts. Some of those texts appear in Mari. There are other texts in other sites that refer to Sarbat. So somehow we have a temple here to these Ishtar of Sarbat. So there's some sort of so there's not just one, but they appear to be several Ishtar deities in Mari. So why are they several? Why is this different from what we find in the south, where they have Inanna? Are there different deities? Does it depend on the geographical location, or why do we have these different variations? And this is where I think the connection with genealogy is important. This is where I see that connection with genealogy. So I mentioned that Mari is a very interesting place because it's very varied. And from what we know of the kings of Mari, we don't know so much. But again, when I mentioned earlier that they're not just necessarily the sons of, father and son and grandson and whatever, they're different. They come from different families. Not necessarily, there could be some that are actually father and son, but not necessarily all of them. And because of the location of Mari and its trading connections to the north and to the south, I think that these two temples that were found, so the Ishtar male and the Ishtar Sarbat, actually reflect perhaps two different genealogies in the rulers of Mari. And we find there was a statue of a king in the Ishtar male temple, and in the other temple we have statues of different people that have dedications, some of them on behalf of other kings that are from a slightly earlier period in the chronology of Mari. Mm-hmm. So I think these could be related to different, I don't really want to say ethnicities, because they're not different ethnicities, mm-hmm. They're just different king groups, perhaps might be better. Different king groups that might be connected to other regions that connect Mari together, the different families and the different groups in Mari, and so on and so forth. And so I think that could be that connection, and it has to do a bit more with the sort of genealogy of these rulers in the history of Mari. Mm-hmm. So that's I think what's happening. And interestingly, when we move into the second millennium BC, so Mari is conquered by the Akkadians. It is not completely abandoned, but it undergoes a period of a bit of like not a strong period and so on, and then it begins to kind of recuperate, and during the Uruk period there seems to be a strong connection with the kings of Ur, and in the palace, which is on the right in green, we begin to see more evidence of these connections. So there is a chapel that is called is one of the rooms in the one of the courts of the palace, and that has a fresco that represents Nana and Inanna, very much in a southern Ur-3 style. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a strong influence there. And this is a different thing. This is they're being sort of brought into the palace, and they're connected to the seat of power at the time, which is Ur, mm-hmm. right? And then even later, a bit later, during a very strong period for Mari, during the sort of old Babylonian period, when they're sort of fighting against Hammurabi, and now he ends up conquering Mari. Mm-hmm. So we have another fresco, which is from a slightly later date, in a second court, which is a court that leads into the throne room. And here we have Ishtar in a more warlike representation, and sort of very much connected to the king, which is represented from the time of Zimri-Lin or around that time, sort of in a way next to the king. And this is when we actually see someone like a ruler directly facing the goddess. I don't know if you noticed, but there's always needs to be someone in between a human and the city deity or a deity. You would never see them like face to face. Contact. But in this case, we see that. So there's a much closer relationship there, very much connected to power, very much connected to the king here inside the palace and so on. So what I see here is, a movement from this fluidity and variability of the early dynastic period, when they're sort of creating these connections to power, but they're still outside the palace. It's still, is not as connected with the palace, to this later period when we see a much stronger relationship. And now we have, I think, more of this composite identity that we see for Inanna Ishtar, which we begin to see as being this deity that is somehow connected to warfare and sex and so on, which I think is part of the same kind of realm of kingship and control and so on. So that's a bit what I see happening in Mari. And this is what sort of underpins some of the theories that I explained earlier on about genealogy and the construction of power and the role of this deity. So I don't think it is the same deity in all the sites that that I've put on the map. I think during the early dynastic, there is a sense to kind of try to connect the emerging structure of kingship, because it's just beginning to appear. We begin to see palaces, and they're finding ways of connecting themselves with the divine world and how to do that. And I think that they're using this idea or this idea of Inanna or Ishtar to create that. And through that process, through the everyday rituals, through hundreds of years, the identity and the image of what we come to know as Inanna and later as Ishtar is emerging. So it's in the processes themselves. One of the key things that I sort of challenge in my thesis is this idea that the identity of the goddess stays the same, that she's always she's always the deity of sex, and always the deity of warfare, and always the deity, so that her identity is unchanged. No, I think it's a process of creation over time. And this is a bit what I was trying to do by connecting the archaeology to the images, to the texts as well.
Fascinating.
If that makes sense.
It does. It does. And it's very interesting to hear the nuance behind it, because when you don't go into like the detailed study of like these specifics, it's very easy to kind of just accept the maybe like the glossing that is used to make it more understandable, because it's immensely complex, and you have to have a way to explain it to people who don't have 3, 4, 5 years to spend really in the details. But hearing kind of the assumptions and the evidence behind the simplification that I've come across is absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed it very much. We do actually have a couple of questions. Now seems like a good time to break for them. Everyone, if you do have questions, please put them in the side chat and tag me so that I see them. Is there any evidence for Inanna temples as sacred brothels?
Okay, all right. I don't think we have evidence from any period for that. The idea of I think where you're coming from is from this idea that has come down or be transmitting over a long period of time from Herodotus, that talks about sacred prostitution in connection to the temple of Ishtar. And so for a very long time, when Mesopotamia was rediscovered in the 19th century, a lot of the archaeologists and the Assyriologists of the time were drawing on some of Herodotus' just because they were classicists themselves. So they would have learned that at university and so on. And they were going on the evidence from the Bible or from Greek sources that were known to recreate some of the mythology and some of the material from ancient Mesopotamia. Now, from an archaeological perspective, I don't think there would be any way for us to identify a brothel archaeologically. There's no way we could say with certainty this is a brothel unless we found some sort of like sign outside the door or something. You know? So it would be impossible to say yes or no archaeologically. From the textual evidence, we also don't have any evidence that supports that that hypothesis or that understanding. We know that women could run taverns. In Gilgamesh, we have a woman that is a tavern keeper. So we have at least connection for women as entrepreneurs who are running their own businesses, or at least, you know, running places that seem to be taverns. Whether that was a brothel, that's, you know, there's nothing saying that explicitly at the very least. So I would say to be very careful with that. There is also no evidence textually for ritual prostitution, as far as I'm aware. And I've read about it a bit quite extensively. So there isn't any evidence that young women had to go to a temple and wait in line for men to pick them up before they lose their virginity or anything like that. There is no evidence as far as I know. So, I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of sex going on for sure. Whether you can call that a brothel, I don't think so.
Thank you.
It would be quite complicated.
Yes. Do you think there are valuable insights to be gotten by comparing text and archaeology? For example, in Inanna and 𒀭, Inanna says she'll build a temple on Mount 𒀭. Is it possible to try and identify a real temple on the basis of that, or is that just too much speculation? I've read that this temple could be identified with the one at Ashur.
Okay, with the one in Ashur, is that what it says? Okay, interesting. I had not heard that one, but so I think that the connection between temples and mountains is there. So the temple of Enlil in Nippur is called the 𒀭Support, which means house mountain. So for sure. And the connection of mountains with temples is dynamic. It's not just in the text, but also in the way that the archaeology works. So what we find in Mesopotamia is what we called tells. And a tell is basically an archaeological site that looks like the sort of springs from the ground like a little mountain. And how does that happen? It happens because when I mentioned earlier about construction, so when you construct something at the ground level, and then over 1,000 years, you keep building on top of it, it ends up basically accruing basically levels of occupation, and ends up looking like a mound or, you know, a hill that is in a way made up of this archaeology. And then the idea, there's different interpretations for this, but some people have suggested that a ziggurat, which is obviously a ritual monument, kind of represents that sort of mounting and takes it up even further up, so that you end up sort of creating a structure that moves vertically into the sky to some extent. So the idea of the 𒀭of Enlil being house mountain is connected to this idea of a ziggurat, kind of moving beyond the level of where humans would be living, but sort of moving it up closer to the sky. So that's one way of connecting it. The mountains itself also has a very interesting connection with mythology in Mesopotamia. So 𒀭, which is the Sumerogram for mountain, can be connected with the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, and the mountains to the east of Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia is pretty flat, if you think about it. So the mountains are the mountains to the east, which are the Zagros Mountains. And that is a lot where a lot of some of these myths take place. So Inanna goes to the mountains and so on. So it's somehow mythological, but it's also partly based on the reality of living in a very flat landscape, where to the east you would have these mountain structures. So whether there is a temple that exactly exists on top of a mountain, I don't think we can necessarily draw that conclusion. But we can use the literature to connect, to try and find temples, of course, and it has been done. You know, we know that certain temples dedicated to Inanna existed, or we think that they existed, because a lot of the ones that we do know from the archaeological records also appear in the textual records and in some literary texts. So they appear in administrative texts and they appear in some literary texts. So we know that there is a reality behind that. So I think that's everything I can say about that. Whether I mean, I think a big as it's obviously a metaphor for something else. It's not necessarily a real mountain. It has to do with the Zagros Mountains. It has to do with this dichotomy between the landscape of Mesopotamia and the landscape of the mountains. But I don't think it is necessarily a 100% real. It is based on reality, but it's not necessarily a real place.
Thank you. How at risk were these cities from attack, and did they have high walls?
Okay, yes. So defensive walls begin to appear actually in this period. So before that, I mentioned in Uruk that there wasn't a wall around the central precinct. And so in the early dynastic, we begin to see walls being built around settlements. They were quite substantial structures. They could be up to, they were routinely at least 1 meter to 3 meters in depth. And so very heavy structures and very difficult to cut through. And they would likely have outposts or towers built along the perimeter and gates to protect them. In terms of how high they were, we don't really know. some of them have been, because they are so wide, I mean, technically speaking, they could go quite high up.
Mm-hmm.
None of them, as far as I know, have been preserved to their original height. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were, at least 3-4 meters high in height. It would depend on the site.
Mm-hmm.
And we begin to see the sort of the outside perimeter of a settlement could be fortified, but also inside, in the area that contains sort of the palace or some of the temples, could also have like a secondary wall to protect them as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have had a $9.99 donation. Thank you very much to Should Have Wore Shoes. I like your screen name.
Thank you.
Hans Hanzo, is the destruction of temples in modern wars and their defilement as not being Islamic and natural disasters a big hindrance in identifying temples?
Well, the thing is that the ones that are there hasn't been that much that has been destroyed from already excavated temples. There's two things here. So there's some temples that were excavated and have been maintained in some sort of shape or form. And there are other temples that were excavated in their entirety and nothing remains of them. So for example, the temple in Mari, it was excavated to its foundations. So there's nothing remains of that temple today. And it was all mud brick as well. So there was nothing more. In terms of temples that have been preserved, none of them have been destroyed, but we already know about them because they have been excavated. So, we know the temple of Enlil in Nippur, or we know the temple of Inanna in Uruk. So those have been excavated. So we know about them. So the only sort of layer in which these your question becomes relevant is when we have looting in sites that have not been excavated, or areas of sites that have not been excavated. In that case, the people who go there to loot, they don't know that there is a temple in general, unless for some reason it is known but hasn't been excavated. So, for example, in 𝀭there was a big monumental structure that had been partially excavated. So, and some of it was understood, but obviously there remained a lot of work to be done. And so it was very heavily looted. And as a result, obviously, I think that hinders a lot of our reconstruction of what those buildings were, and the relationship between the architecture and the objects and the text that would have been found inside them. Now, at some point, we'll see whatever was looted from that side come up. It will appear somewhere in the either in the black market or in the real market with a faked background somehow. And I think the key here is that you might be able to, from the texts, connect them to that site because they mention a specific temple, and therefore you know that it must have come from there because it was looted, and you know that it must come from there. But then a lot is still missed. We can connect that, but where were they found? In which context? Was there an archive? Can we reconstruct that archive? Which room in that building were they found? There's a lot of questions that would not be able to be answered. So there would still be a lot. We would be missing so much information from the archaeology that could have been obtained through a legal excavation. What was found with them. So it's not just about the text, it's about everything else that comes with them, you know? So to answer your question, it does hinder the identification of a temple to some extent, but identifying a temple, it should not be the end, the end goal, you know, contextualizing where those objects come from, how they were used, what other remains around them were found, how to date them and how to contextualize them. That is completely lost.
Thank you. We have one last question, and then I think we will wrap things up.
Yes.
If Inanna was still worshipped today as part of a major religion, how do you think it would affect society? Would it be less patriarchal, or would it not make much of a difference? That's an interesting question.
That is a very, very interesting question. You know, and in my research, I actually think that there's two things. I think that it is not necessarily productive to think about Inanna as not being patriarchal. I think a lot of what's going on in this period is building a lot of the foundations for that patriarchal society. And the goddess was the only one that was not subjected to the same standards later on. Women could not behave like Inanna or Ishtar at all. There is, there is something to say about how we project the knowledge that we have about deities on the real lives of humans. I think it's important to differentiate between the two and to kind of read between the lines in how a certain set of religious ideas actually translate in terms of human behavior in society. So I don't think if Inanna were worshipped today as part of a major religion, would be a less patriarchal society. The Virgin Mary is one of the main, if not the most revered female figure in religion, and it is still underpins a very patriarchal society that we live in. So I think there's a big difference between the two in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Interesting questions, everyone, as always. And thank you for your talk. That was incredibly informative and very enjoyable. I hope everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did.
I hope so too.
I have a dog under my desk. Oh, okay.
Oh, what a cutie.
He's a good guy. He's getting antsy though. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody else for joining us. I don't think I have anything special to say. So until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask. How do you know that?
Thank you.